We talk a lot about rights, being recognized on paper, but there's often this stark reality. How often those rights don't actually translate into real change for people on the ground. It's a huge concern, especially for the UN when you look at indigenous people.
Right, this implementation gap they talk about.
Exactly. And worse, sometimes indigenous peoples become almost statistically invisible.
It's striking, isn't it? We have international standards like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRAP, which is a major step forward.
Yeah.
But for so many communities, their day-to-day reality, things like access to their lands, healthcare, decent education, even maintaining their culture, it just hasn't caught up.
Well, that's exactly what we're going to dig into today. There's this really unique initiative designed to tackle that very gap.
The Indigenous Navigator.
That's the one. And what really makes it stand out, I think, is that it's a framework built by and for indigenous peoples themselves.
That by and for part is absolutely critical because historically, so much monitoring and data collection about indigenous peoples was done to them from the outside.
Right, top down.
Yeah. The Navigator flips that. It puts the tools, the power of information directly into the hands of the communities.
So if you've ever wondered, how do we actually track if rights are being respected?
Yeah.
And what happens when the laws say one thing but life looks different? Then this deep dive is definitely for you. We're looking at how this empowers communities and ultimately tries to hold power structures accountable.
And it's such a powerful model, really. Communities taking charge of assessing their own situation, their own rights realization. It's a tool for self-determination in action.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear. We want to really understand how the Indigenous Navigator works, how it monitors UNDRAP implementation, and how it empowers people.
We'll be looking at its origins, the whole structure behind it, the indicators they use.
Yeah, and some real-world examples, too, like in Peru and Malaysia. Plus, its education work and where it's headed.
Sounds good.
All right, let's unpack this. Where did the Indigenous Navigator actually come from? What's the origin story?
Okay, so it officially launched back in 2014, but its roots, they're really deep in Indigenous self-determination principles and this idea of community-based monitoring.
That by and for Indigenous peoples idea again.
Exactly. That's the core principle, setting it apart from, the more typical government-led or external expert approaches.
Right.
There was an initial pilot phase, 2014 to 2016, which got some really crucial support from the EU, the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, EIDHR. And that period was key for sort of building the framework and proving the concept could work.
So it wasn't just about collecting data for its own sake. What was the bigger aim?
The main goal is really to generate data, accessible data that's driven by indigenous people so that they can use it to push for their own development priorities and use it as evidence in their advocacy for rights. A huge part of it is empowering their own organization.
To hold governments accountable.
Exactly. To hold governments, corporations, other actors accountable for their commitments, using their own data as the proof.
This sounds like a massive undertaking. How is it structured? I mean, it can't be just one organization running everything.
Oh, definitely not. It relies on a really interesting collaborative architecture. It's a consortium, really.
Yep.
You've got leading indigenous peoples organizations like IWGIA, AIPP, Forest Peoples Program, Tebteba, working alongside human rights institutions like the Danish Institute for Human Rights.
That's quite a lineup.
Yeah. And the ILO, the International Labor Organization, is a key partner, too, bringing all their expertise on things like ILO Convention 169.
And funding. You mentioned the EU earlier.
Right. The European Union provides significant financial backing, specifically the European Commission's International Partnerships Directorate. That's been vital.
So that's the sort of central hub.
Yeah.
But how does it actually operate in different countries?
That happens through a global network of country partners. These are usually national or local indigenous organizations right there on the ground.
Oh.
They're the ones doing the work, engaging communities, running the workshops, collecting the data, putting together reports. You see this in Latin America, Asia, Africa.
You mentioned Peru and Malaysia earlier.
Exactly, like JOS in Malaysia or Peru, Equidad in Peru. They're the national implementers.
It sounds like a really clever mix, doesn't it? You've got the direct community connection, but also the technical know-how and international reach.
Precisely. It blends that grassroots legitimacy, the traditional knowledge, with the sort of methodological rigor and institutional backup from the human rights groups and UN partners. It aims to be both grounded and robust.
But that raises a point, doesn't it? With external funding like from the EU,
Yeah.
how do they keep it genuinely Indigenous-led?
That's a constant balancing act, a really critical question.
Yeah. Is there a risk that the donor priorities could creep in? And also, you said the current EU funding runs out end of 2025.
Right.
What about long-term sustainability? Who owns the platform, the data going forward?
These are absolutely key strategic challenges. The buy and for principle is the bedrock, but maintaining that genuine Indigenous control while relying on external funding requires ongoing vigilance. And yes, long-term financial and operational sustainability is definitely a major focus beyond the current funding cycle.
And this network you described, these country partners,
Yeah.
it sounds like it does more than just funnel data upwards.
Oh, much more. It really fosters a global community of practice. Partners share lessons, strategies, support each other.
Like a network effect.
Exactly. They can coordinate advocacy, amplify local issues onto the regional or international stage. It strengthens the collective voice.
Okay, so a strong network, clear mission. Let's get into the nuts and bolts. What exactly are they tracking? What's in this framework?
Right. The core of the Navigator is its human rights indicator framework. This is the tool that allows for that systematic look at how rights, mainly from UNDRP, but also others, are actually being implemented.
And how was that developed? Did they just pick indicators off a shelf?
No, not at all. It was a multi-stage process, and crucially, it involved a lot of consultation with Indigenous partners worldwide.
To make sure it reflects their priorities.
Precisely. Their understanding of what their rights mean in practice.
So how do they break down something as big as UNDIP?
They organized its many articles into 13 broad thematic domains. Think big categories.
Okay.
Then those domains are broken down further into 32 more specific subcategories. And the key thing is, each subcategory is directly linked back to specific UNDIP articles and often to other human rights treaties too.
Could you give us a couple of examples of those main themes, just to get a feel for it?
Sure. You've got things like self-determination, which covers rights to autonomy, free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC, cultural integrity, looking at language, heritage, traditional knowledge, lands, territories, and resources, a huge one, obviously, covering recognition, protection, dispossession issues.
Consent.
And then others like education, health, participation in public life.
Yeah.
The list goes on. All told, there are over 150 distinct indicators. It's really comprehensive.
Wow, 150. That's detailed. But how do they measure these? Is it just about checking if laws exist?
No, it's more sophisticated than that. They use three main types of indicators. First, structural indicators. These do look at the legal and policy framework. Does the country officially recognize these rights in its laws?
Right, the on-paper part.
Then process indicators. These measure the state's efforts to implement those rights. Are there programs? Is there a budget allocated? What steps are being taken? And finally, the crucial ones, outcome indicators. These try to capture the actual results on the ground. Are Indigenous peoples actually enjoying these rights in their daily lives? What's the real-world impact?
That makes so much sense. So you could have great laws on land rights.
That's right.
Fine, structural.
But maybe zero budget for mapping those lands.
Right, pride.
So the outcome is people are still losing their land.
Exactly. Looking at all three together lets you pinpoint where the problem lies. Is it the law itself, the lack of political will or resources, or are the policies just not working? Shows you the implementation gap.
So it's built on UNDRP, but does it connect to other things? And how do they handle the diversity? I mean, Indigenous contexts vary hugely around the world.
Good questions. While UNDRP is central, the indicators were designed to align with other key instruments too, like ILO 169, core UN human rights treaties, and also the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs.
Ah, the SDGs. Okay.
The aim was to have enough universality for comparison, but, and this is key, also build in flexibility for cultural sensitivity and local adaptation.
How do they manage that?
Concepts might mean different things, right?
Yeah.
So the survey questions, the way data is collected, can be adjusted to fit the local context, the local language. It went through rigorous reviews, consultations, field testing to get that balance. What about collective rights? Things like rights to territory or self-governance. Those seem harder to measure than individual rights.
You're absolutely right. That's a major challenge for human rights monitoring generally. Traditional indicators often focus on the individual.
Yeah.
The Navigator makes a real effort to tackle this. It has specific domains and indicators designed to capture these collective dimensions. It's complex, but it's a really important contribution.
And the link to the SDGs you mentioned, is there a risk there? Could focusing on SDGs maybe dilute the focus on specific indigenous rights?
That's a valid point and something they have to navigate carefully.
Right.
Linking to SDGs helps compare the situation of indigenous peoples with the general population, which can expose discrimination. That's powerful.
Yeah, you could show disparities.
But there's a potential danger if SDG priorities, often set by states, overshadow indigenous-specific rights outlined in UNDRIP, or if concepts like poverty are measured using mainstream definitions that don't fit indigenous worldviews.
So it's about using the SDG link strategically, but keeping UNDRP and indigenous perspectives front and center.
Exactly. And we actually have a table 1, that lays out these core themes and links them straight to UNDRP articles. You can really see that direct alignment.
Okay, that gives us a good picture of the what. Let's talk about the how. How does this data actually get collected on the ground? What's the process like for communities?
Well, the whole methodology really hinges on community-led data generation.
Okay.
Indigenous organizations, the communities themselves, they're the main actors. They use the Navigator tools, but they drive the process.
So it's not just someone parachuting in with a clipboard?
Definitely not. It usually involves several stages, facilitated by those national or local partners we talked about.
Can you walk us through those stages?
Sure. It often starts with sensitization, just explaining the Navigator, its purpose, getting buy-in, then mobilizing people, raising awareness about their rights based on UNDRP and national laws.
Building understanding first.
Right. Then comes the data collection itself. This is often done through participatory workshops, focus groups, not just filling out forms alone.
More interactive.
Much more. Then compiling the findings and, crucially, reporting back to the communities, sharing the results in ways that make sense to them.
And adapting the tools, language, cultural context.
Absolutely vital. Questionnaires get translated, adapted to be culturally appropriate, asking the right questions in the right way.
It sounds like the process itself could be really valuable even before you get to the advocacy part.
It really is. We hear that a lot. Just participating, discussing rights, understanding their situation better, that can be incredibly empowering for people.
But validating that data must be a challenge, making sure it's accurate, seen as credible by, say, governments.
It's a constant challenge, yes. Balancing that local, contextual richness with the need for data that's robust and comparable. Ensuring indigenous perspectives are central to validation.
And how does it connect the dots between what's happening in a specific community and the national picture, the laws and policies?
The framework is built for that. You collect national-level data on the laws and policies, the structural stuff,
right,
and you compare that directly with the community-level data about lived experiences, the outcome stuff.
So that's where the implementation gap really shows up.
Exactly. It highlights where the law isn't translating into reality. Plus, using standardized indicators allows comparisons across communities, across countries over time. You can track change.
And compare with the general population, too, using those SDG links.
Yes. To expose discrimination. Are indigenous peoples being left behind on key development indicators? The data can show that starkly.
So the data becomes a real tool.
Precisely. A tool for empowerment, for advocacy. Communities document their own reality from their perspective.
And use that evidence
to demand their rights, access justice, push for better policies. They can feed it into UN processes like the UPR, treaty body reviews, inform the special rapporteur, raise public awareness. The whole methodology is tied to empowerment, mobilization. Participation is an intervention.
But I imagine that kind of data, highlighting failures, could be politically sensitive.
Oh, absolutely. Exposing disparities, critiquing government action or inaction, it can be contested.
Yeah.
States might push back.
Yeah.
Which is why the methodological rigor, the transparency, the Navigator process is so important. It builds credibility. And the emphasis on indigenous ownership of the data aligns with data sovereignty principles. It's their data, not extractive research.
Okay, we've got a good handle on the process. Let's talk impact. What's it actually achieving? Are there documented successes?
Yes, definitely. We're seeing growing evidence of impact. Communities consistently report increased rights awareness, feeling more empowered.
That's huge in itself.
It really is. The process often sparks community mobilization, internal discussions they might not have had before.
And using the data.
The data has been used effectively to lobby local governments for support, to provide crucial shadow reports to UN bodies like the UPR and treaty committees, and to push for policy changes nationally or regionally.
Any examples of filling data gaps? You mentioned statistical invisibility earlier.
Yes, in several countries, Peru, Philippines, Suriname, Tanzania, are examples. Navigator data has helped fill significant gaps where official statistics just weren't capturing the reality for Indigenous peoples.
That's really encouraging. What would you say are the core strengths of this whole approach? Why does it seem to work?
Well, number one is that it's Indigenous-led and owned. That ensures relevance, buy-in.
Makes sense.
The framework is incredibly comprehensive, covering the breadth of UNDRIP. The standardized indicators are key for comparisons and tracking change.
A participatory method.
Crucial for ownership empowerment. It's a powerful advocacy tool. It bridges Indigenous knowledge and human rights frameworks. The tools are free, accessible. And that small grants facility is brilliant, linking data directly to action projects.
Okay, but it can't all be smooth sailing. What are the big hurdles, the challenges they face?
Oh, there are definitely persistent hurdles. The digital divide is a major one, lack of connectivity infrastructure in many communities.
Right.
Interpreting complex legal ideas across languages and cultures, that takes real skill and sensitivity. The whole thing is resource-intensive time, people, money.
Data validation.
Still a challenge ensuring consistency globally while respecting local context. And then there's government responsiveness or lack thereof. Political will is key.
Sustainability for the partners.
Yes, long-term funding and operational capacity for those local organizations is a big concern. And sometimes you encounter research fatigue or trust issues in communities that have been overstudied.
You mentioned a double burden earlier. Can you unpack that a bit more?
Yeah, it's this tough reality that the very marginalization the Navigator tries to address, lack of education, poor infrastructure, discrimination, often makes it harder for communities to use the tool effectively.
So the problems they're documenting also hinder their ability to document
In
them.
some ways, yes. It's a real challenge.
It sounds like there's more to the impact than just the numbers, though.
Absolutely. There's a huge soft impact. Community empowerment, self-esteem, stronger local governance, collective agency. Things harder to quantify, but incredibly important.
Sparking conversations.
Definitely. It acts as a catalyst for dialogue within communities, between different groups, and importantly, with authorities. Even if policy doesn't change overnight, opening those communication channels is valuable. We've got Table 2, by the way, which sums up these strengths and limitations nicely.
Okay, let's make this even more concrete. Let's dig into those case studies. Peru and Malaysia. What did the Navigator uncover there?
All right, let's start with Peru. The partner there is Peru Equidad. They've used the Navigator questionnaires multiple times, 2015, 2017, and again just this year, 2024.
So they have trend data.
Exactly. Now, Peru actually recognized Indigenous rights in its constitution way back in 1920, but many feel the 1993 constitution was a step backward, especially on land protection.
And did the Navigator data reflect that?
It seems to. Key findings pointed to laws and administrative actions that seem to be actively weakening Indigenous rights, growing threats to territories from mining, logging, agribusiness.
What about consultation? FPIC.
Major issues there. Findings showed prior consultation mechanisms were often ineffective, just box-ticking exercises. Also, a disturbing rise in violence and threats against Indigenous leaders defending their lands.
And the statistical invisibility.
That came through strongly, too. Official data just not reflecting their realities. So, yeah, the picture in Peru, based on this data, is one of systematic erosion of rights, despite formal recognition. And having data over time really shows that trend.
Okay, quite concerning. What about Malaysia? What's the story there?
In Malaysia, the partner is JOAS, a network of Orang Asal, or Indigenous peoples organizations. They kicked off their work with the Navigator in early 2022.
And their goals?
They want to use the data to boost their advocacy, influence policy, contribute to Malaysia's next UPR report at the UN, and make sure SDG implementation actually includes Indigenous peoples properly.
What are the big challenges they're finding?
Land rights are a huge one. Lack of formal recognition of customary lands, constant encroachment, development projects pushed through without proper consent, without FPIC.
Similar issues to Peru on consultation, then?
Yes, deficiencies in consultation are a key finding. Also, big socioeconomic gaps. Poverty, access to good education, healthcare. The need for cultural and language preservation is critical. And generally, policy and institutional gaps that limit their participation in decisions that affect them.
So the Navigator helps them map all these interconnected issues.
Exactly. It provides that systematic evidence base for their advocacy and policy recommendations.
You also mentioned global education initiatives funded through this. Tell us more about that.
Yes, this is done via their small grants facility, and it's really powerful. It directly links the data identifying needs in education to community-led action.
What kind of project?
A real variety. Projects focused on revitalizing indigenous languages, creating learning materials, sometimes getting languages used more in schools.
That's fantastic.
Others tackled barriers to access, like helping families get birth certificates needed for school enrollment in places like Kenya or Tanzania.
Practical stuff.
Very practical. Training teachers in culturally relevant methods, supporting elders to pass on traditional knowledge in linguistic nests or similar programs. And projects focused on engaging governments directly, advocating for better Indigenous education policies.
So it really translates the data into tangible action for self-determination in education.
Absolutely. It's a great example of that data action cycle.
And looking across these cases, Peru, Malaysia, the education projects, you really see how interconnected rights are, don't you? Land affects culture, affects education.
Completely. And you see the synergy, the data identifies the need, the partner organizations facilitate action, and the grants provide the resources to make it happen. Table 3 actually gives a quick comparison of the key challenges in Peru and Malaysia side by side.
It really shows how the tool adapts but identifies core recurring issues.
Okay, so the Navigator is clearly making a difference, but you said it's also evolving. What's next for it? It's definitely not static. The framework is designed to evolve, to respond to new challenges and priorities identified by Indigenous peoples themselves.
Like what kind of priorities?
Well, they're actively expanding it. Just this year, 2024, they finished developing new specialized modules, one on climate change and Indigenous rights.
Very timely.
And another on human rights and environmental due diligence. This one looks closely at corporate accountability and the state's duty to regulate business activities impacting rights.
And more planned.
Yes. For 2025, they're aiming to finalize a module on biodiversity, linking directly to the big global agreement, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework.
How do they develop these new parts? Same process?
Yes, based on wide consultations with Indigenous peoples, drawing on their expertise, and using the established human rights indicator methodology from the UN Human Rights Office, OHCHR.
And gender. Is that being integrated more?
A major focus. The new modules explicitly emphasize collecting gender disaggregated data, recognizing that Indigenous women often face unique, intersecting forms of discrimination. These new surveys then get integrated into the main Navigator portal, keeping it current.
So it's staying relevant and connecting to wider global agendas.
Absolutely. It feeds into monitoring the SDGs for Indigenous peoples. It's a key resource for UN bodies, the Special Rapporteur, EMRIP, the Permanent Forum. It helps Indigenous groups participate more effectively in international discussions.
Making the tools available broadly.
Yes, the tools are free. The goal is to embed Indigenous rights more firmly into global environmental governance, into discussions about corporate responsibility. And that focus on gender data is critical for aligning with frameworks like CEDAW and UNDRIPE's own Article 22 on women's rights.
Okay, as we start to pull these threads together then, what are the main takeaways from our deep dive on the Indigenous Navigator?
I'd say the key thing is its significance as a community-led tool. It's genuinely buy-in for Indigenous peoples, monitoring UNDRIP implementation from their perspective.
And its strengths.
Empowerment is huge, providing that solid, data-driven evidence for advocacy. And its adaptability, its ability to evolve and tackle new issues like climate change or biodiversity.
And it certainly throws that implementation gap we started with into sharp relief.
It really does. It provides concrete evidence of how challenging it remains to make Indigenous rights a reality on the ground, day to day, all around the world.
So, for you listening, maybe take a moment to consider just how important these kinds of community-led initiatives are for human rights monitoring generally, and the power data has when it's used to demand accountability. You could explore UNDRP itself further, look up some of the organizations involved, IWGIA, AIPP, TIPTEBA, the country partners, or just think about how data is used or could be used in other social justice struggles you care about.
And maybe the final thought to leave you with is this. What responsibility do states and all of us in the international community really have? Not just to, tolerate or passively support initiatives like the Navigator,
Right.
but to actively engage with them, to act on the evidence they provide, even when it's uncomfortable. Because ultimately, realizing Indigenous rights depends on that continued vigilance, that genuine partnership, and a real commitment to turning data into lasting change.